One of the things that I have always enjoyed and found fascinating is when something old is unearthed or found, and suddenly what they thought was garbage was actually a priceless artifact. You know, you've read stories or seen them online where some piece of art left in someone's attic in Europe for decades and generations turns out to be some priceless artifact and is now from some famous painter. Or a vase that is bought in an antique store and looks absolutely atrocious and was bought for a few dollars is now suddenly worth millions of dollars because of who made it and what part of collection it's a part of. Those things are fascinating to watch, but one of my favorite ones is from 1922, where in the Valley of the Kings in Egypt, they dig down to a gravesite and they poke a hole through a wall and they hold up a candle to this hole, and gold reflects the light back out to the people looking in. Many of you know what this discovery was. It was the discovery of King Tut's tomb in ancient Egypt, or in the Valley of the Kings. And this was such a massive discovery because it was largely untouched, right? Most of the things were still in this tomb. They have pulled out 5,000 artifacts from this tomb that are on display in different museums around the world. As they travel around the world, they are insured for more than $1 billion because of just the amount of gold that there is in there. They found gold chariots. They found lots of pottery, obviously, lots of jewelry. His coffin, his sarcophagus, it had 3 layers to it, like 3 coffins in a coffin, like a Russian doll set almost. And the middle one was 240 pounds of pure gold. That's where we get the famous mask that is the most famous artifact from his tomb. And in the midst of all of this, there was also some bizarre things, right? There was these clay jars that were filled with his organs. There was also over 100 pairs of footwear, of shoes for him. He wasn't going anywhere, but he had 100 pairs of shoes, and they were on the bottom of them was painted depictions of his enemies, so that even in the afterlife, he was trampling over his foes. All of these things were buried in there. And now, why so much? Why so much stuff? Well, ancient Egyptians believed that he would need these things in the afterlife. But the ironic thing is that the reason why this tomb was so famous was because the stuff was actually there when they unearthed it. Most of these famous graves in the Valley of the Kings, within a few years, have been raided by thieves, thought, I need that stuff more in my earthly life than you need that in the afterlife, so I'm just going to take it and sell it instead, right? But this is one of the few tombs where they found almost everything in it. Now, if these practices were held today, of burying somebody with all the stuff they might need in the afterlife, or their things that they thought were valuable in their earthly life, what would we bury with the person who was buried in Nanaimo? What's that? Foam? Oh, their phone. Yes, that's true. Their phone. With plugged into an external extension cord for eternity. Yes. Thank you. Their phone, probably maybe still some expensive jewelry. That hat, that's only going to be buried with you, no one else. That hat, maybe pieces of bank account statements that highlight their wealth, or pieces of paper that highlight their achievements, whether it was some sort of schooling achievement or discovery they made. Devices, yes, electronics. All these things might be buried today with what we consider this is what was most valuable in this life, and we're going to need it for after we die. But as the saying goes, the person who dies with the most toys still dies. And maybe you've heard this line, this is great, I only heard it recently, that you will never see a hearse driving, pulling a U-Haul behind it. Recently, they staged this photo, so now you can say, I have seen it actually. But probably the U-Haul was full of just more coffins, if we're honest. Jesus spoke a lot about money and about wealth and about generosity. And Jesus, being someone who very clearly died and then 3 days later was raised from the dead, his word carries a lot of weight around what we actually can take with us beyond the grave. What is true value? What is worth sharing and being generous with? So what did Jesus teach about wealth, about possessions, about generosity? We're in our sermon series right now called On Earth as It Is in Heaven. We've been chasing these teachings of what Jesus said in his most famous sermon called the Sermon on the Mount. It's from Matthew 5, 6, and 7, and these famous teachings have been studied and unpacked across the last 2,000 years. They've helped dictate laws in different countries. They are by far some of the most wonderful and revolutionary and powerful teachings that come from the lips of Jesus. And as we've been going through this sermons, these teachings, an important framework for having the understanding these teachings is that the Sermon on the Mount is a pathway for growing in His grace. That when you've experienced the forgiveness and the love of God and you've decided to follow Jesus and you're going, okay, how do I grow in God's love? How do I become more Christ-like? These teachings are a map. They're a pathway forward of doing just that. So if you're not a follower of Jesus, you can just ignore everything I say the rest of today. But last week we left off when he was teaching about fasting, about the rhythms of eating food and not eating food. And we talked about last week that fasting, when I'm fasting from food, it's a way of giving up something physical to gain something spiritual. As when someone who's young loses their eyesight suddenly, their brain rewires itself to heighten other senses, their touch, their smell, their hearing. And fasting does the same thing for us. We give up something physical to be able to pray and connect to God in a deeper way. And that fasting dials in our focus on His presence. So we're praying from a different place than just a full stomach, but from a place of desperation. And some of you may have tried fasting this last week from a meal or something like that. That's great. And I know that some can't fast due to medical reasons, and they chose maybe other things other than food, and that's wonderful too. But today, we look as Jesus finishes his teaching on fasting, he now moves into the area of wealth and possessions and generosity. We're going to read this section from Matthew 6 in its entirety, and then we'll go back slowly through it. So if you have a Bible, you can turn there, or your device, or it'll be up on the screen as well. And he begins teaching on this in chapter 6, verse 19. He says, "Don't store up treasures here on earth, where moths eat them and rust destroys them, and thieves break in and steal. Store up your treasures in heaven, where moths and rust cannot destroy, and thieves do not break in and steal. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be. Your eye is like a lamp that provides light for your body. When your eye is healthy, your whole body is filled with light. But when your eye is unhealthy, your whole body is filled with darkness. And if the light you think you have is actually darkness, how deep that darkness is. No one can serve two masters. For you will hate one and love the other. You'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money." Pause there. Jesus is setting up three contrasting images for us. He's setting up the contrast of two treasures of heaven and earth. He's contrasting between our eye being filled with light or filled with darkness, two visions of what we are looking at. And then he's also setting up the contrast between God as your master and enslavement to money as your master. So two treasures, two visions, two masters. And let's take a deeper look at this first one of two treasures. He said, "Don't store up treasures here on earth, where moths eat them and rust destroys them, and thieves break in and steal. Store up treasures in heaven, where moths and rust cannot destroy them, and thieves do not break in and steal. Wherever your treasure is, there the desires of your heart will also be." Now, as we hear this, it's easy to go, okay, I guess I just need to empty my bank account, and I need to declare bankruptcy and get rid of everything I own and sell it all off. No, that's not what he's teaching here. Jesus was not against having wealth or having possessions. He wasn't against things like having life insurance or saving for retirement or putting money aside for the inevitable repairs on your vehicle, especially if it's a Ford. Like, he was not against those. That one's for you, Franz, wherever you are there. Not against those things. But to make treasure, money, and wealth the primary goal of your life and your fixation, and also in contrast with having a hard heart towards the needs of others, that's what he's speaking against. If you were to take a moment and think of a person in your life who's unbelievably generous, Yes, with their finances, but also with their time, their energy, the way they care for others, that they're willing to lend their car out, that they're willing to buy groceries for someone, that they're willing to drive someone around town that needs help. They're willing to give up their time to volunteer at the food bank. If you think of that person who generosity is ingrained into a habit of who they are, would you say that they're generally a joyful person? Likely. I've yet to meet a very grumpy, angry, generous person. Jesus said it was more blessed to give than to receive. And for years, I practically thought, well, Jesus, you're probably wrong on that teaching. But the fact remains that when the habit of generosity is practiced, when it is included in our weekly, monthly rhythms, we gain back the blessings and the joy of relationships and memories and valuable treasure in heaven. If we were to step outside the Sermon on the Mount for a moment and look at one of the practical teachings of Paul that he writes to a young pastor named Timothy around wealthy people in Timothy's own congregation, this is what Paul said around wealth. He said, "Teach those who are rich in this world not to be proud and not to trust in their money, which is so unreliable. Their trust should be in God, who richly gives us all we need for our enjoyment. Tell them to use their money to do good. They should be rich in good works and generous to those in need, always being ready to share with others. By doing this, they will be storing up their treasure as a good foundation for the future, so that they may experience true life." Paul is echoing the teachings of Jesus of storing up good works, being generous to those in need. And does that mean bankrupt yourself? No, it means being a good steward of what you have already. Recognizing your ultimate trust is not in your wealth, but in God who blessed you with it, to care for others. And this mindset that Jesus is speaking to, of being generous, is described in his next teaching here on two visions. He says this, "Your eye is like a lamp that provides light for your body. When your eye is healthy, your whole body is filled with light. But when your eye is unhealthy, your whole body is filled with darkness. And if the light you think you have is actually darkness, how deep that darkness is." Now, reading this, it's more cryptic at first glance. What does Jesus mean by this? Why is a conversation, a teaching about your eye and light and darkness included and sandwiched between teachings of treasures in heaven and what is your master, God, or enslavement to money? Why is this teaching put in between it? It's because there's a Greek idiom of this first century that says to have a healthy eye was to be someone who's singularly focused and generous. And to have an unhealthy eye was your focus was not in the right places, and to be stingy and greedy and not generous. So to say that someone had a healthy eye in this day means that they're focused well, that they're focused on generosity, and it was filling them up with good things on the inside. If we want to sort out for ourselves, do we have a healthy focus on generosity, we could figure that out by looking at two main things. Two main apps on your phone, actually. Your calendar app and your bank app. Of looking at those, where do I spend my time and where do I spend my wealth? Does it reflect someone pursuing generosity? And as Jesus said, if the light we think we have is actually darkness, meaning the lack of generosity, the hoarding and desire for more, and clinging to that as our ultimate treasure, then how deep that darkness is, because it will not satisfy the longings of the soul. Lastly, Jesus summarized this teaching here with verse 24. He says, "No one can serve two masters, for you will hate one and love the other. You'll be devoted to one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and be enslaved to money." Two masters, God or the enslavement of money. And he's saying, which one will you prioritize? To surrender to Jesus, you prioritize building God's kingdom here, sharing with those in need. Surrendering to the enslavement of money, you prioritize building your own wealthy kingdom. Money for a follower of Jesus is simply just a tool for helping show his love and his grace in the here and now. And the habit of generosity keeps giving. It keeps going and keeps sharing. And the ripple effect is just absolutely beautiful and only something that he can do. I found over the years that God is always teaching me more about generosity. With my time, my energy, my finances, my caring, and to try and see life from the abundance of the love he has shown me, and then continuing to build a deeper habit of generosity. Because generosity is easy to do as a one-off, is it not? To give a donation once and forget about it. To buy somebody a meal once and move on. To get someone a coffee once and that's it. But generosity as a habit is hard. To build it into a weekly, monthly rhythm, that is an act of trust and faith in God, and it reflects where our focus is. Because the pull and temptation of greed is always going to be there. There's always a desire to fill with more stuff, to find our security and identity in what we own or what we might own. An example of this comes from a professor I had who talked about being on a plane, and God forbid we're away from shopping while we're flying. They have that Sky Mall magazine right in front of you in the seat, right? And he pulled it out, and he decided to do an experiment where he would go through every item in the magazine and consider it, see how much he wanted it or needed it, and then move on. It took him about 30 minutes to go through the whole magazine. And when he was done, wow, did he realize how much he really needed in this life that he didn't own yet. See, this professor was bald. And they, in this magazine, had a shaving foam dispenser that would come out heated foam. That is a need for a bald man. That would be just fantastic. He thought about that item for years. The pull to stockpile and fill up a U-Haul that will drag behind a hearse, the temptation of that will always be present. So, as Jesus teaches here, it's like, what is your ultimate priority? Is it the Creator or is it what He's created? Oh, there's a woman named Oslo McCarty, and we would never have heard of her unless it was for her incredible acts of generosity. She lived, no husband, no kids. She dropped out of school at grade 6 to support the family by being a laundress, and she did that for the entirety of her life, almost till she died. She only had to stop doing laundry and washing clothes because of arthritis that stopped her. But she was an incredibly frugal saver. She didn't own a car, she would walk to church. And even though she lived in the brutal Mississippi heat, it wasn't until her late years that someone forced her to buy an air conditioner for her home. But she had accumulated some wealth in her estate. And so with her bank and with an attorney, one who she'd actually washed the clothes of, helped her set up what was going to happen to her estate when she died. 10% of her estate went to her church, 30% of it went to 3 living relatives that she still had, and the remaining 60% went to the University of the Southern Mississippi. And the fund that was set aside in 1995, for students who couldn't afford to go to university she donated $150,000 in one lump sum. In today's money, that'd be equivalent to about $310,000 is what she donated to the university. And the amount has grown over the years. It's up to about $600,000 that has been helped 100 different students go to university. And they put a statue of her on the campus, a bronze statue, there sitting with a Bible. And people could come, and there's a chair next to it. They could sit and reflect about her incredible generosity. Oslo said this. She said, "When I leave this world, I can't carry nothing away from here. Whatever I have, it's going to be left right here for somebody. Some child can get their education. I can help them along, because you can't do nothing now unless you get your education." Now, her generosity has continued. Now, each Christmas at that statue, people will leave anonymous gifts there for international students who cannot go home for the holidays. The habit of generosity keeps giving, keeps going, keeps sharing. And for those who are generous and they give, and for those who receive, when we are generous with our time, our wealth, our care for others, we also receive gifts of joy, relationships, memories. And when we receive someone's generosity, not only do we receive the gift of whatever that was, we also receive the surprise and the thankfulness that someone cares and cares deeply enough to act. May we continue as a church to be known for our generosity for each other, for the church at large, and for our local community. Join with me as I close in prayer. Heavenly Father, I thank you, Lord, that you are a God who lavishes his love on your children. That we understand generosity through your very presence and your actions. And Lord, may we continue to have an active tension in our lives of being generous with all that you have given us. I pray these things in your most precious name, Lord. Amen. Please stand as we close in song.